Hello, and welcome to Adventures in Regression Therapy. I'm Steve Burgess, hypnotherapist and regression specialist, and together with members of my team, we'll be introducing you to the fascinating world of past life regression. In each episode, we'll be discussing the importance of regression therapy, the range of physical, emotional, and spiritual issues it can help with, and sharing some of our clients' stories from the many thousands of regression sessions we've facilitated over the years. We hope you enjoy the ride with us as we explore the power of past life regression. Hello, Burgess here, and welcome to Adventures in Regression Therapy with my colleague and team member Monique Glover. Today, we're going to talk about ancestral trauma and what this basically is and how we work with it. In regression, when we're doing regression work on any issue, remember the concept of regression, the model, all of our issues come from locked-in feelings and emotions from past traumas. We want to find out where the traumas are in the past that are causing the issue now and release those traumas. And in regression, we work in three areas: this lifetime, and most of us carry baggage from this life, past lifetimes, and our ancestors' lives. These are sometimes called the genealogical or inherited traumas. And it appears if a person is traumatized in the life, if they don't release that trauma, then the trauma can be passed down. Sometimes it's like it's in the genes and it comes down to subsequent generations. Now, it doesn't always come down in every single generation. Sometimes it will skip one or two generations. And even within a family, let's say there are three sisters in a family and there's some ancestral trauma from the grandmother, it may only connect to one of those three sisters and the other two, it doesn't affect them. So what we're doing in regression is our aim is to go back into the ancestor's life and relive the trauma. Now, what this means from our client's perspective, often they are actually reliving the trauma as if they're in their ancestor's body, looking out through that ancestor's eyes and feeling what the ancestor felt, which is quite remarkable. And it's a little bit similar to when we're in a past life and we're in the past life in that body experiencing things as though we are that person all those many, many years ago. So some clients experience it in the body, what we call in the first person. And some clients, they are experiencing the ancestor's life as if they're very close to the ancestor. So they're sort of seeing what happened and picking up on the ancestor's feelings. And that can be just as valid as a session when they're in the first person. And when we talk about ancestral traumas, we mean going back through the bloodline. So these are traumas we inherit from our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, etc., etc., etc. Generally, and this is a generalization, these ancestral traumas go no more than about 7 generations back. However, certainly Monique and myself have had clients who their ancestral trauma will go many, many generations back before that and has been affecting so many of the ancestors as it comes down through the line. So that's the background, that's the theory, if you like. And it's fascinating therapy. We even have quite often, but not always, some clients who, let's say they've experienced a trauma in their mother's or father's life or a grandparent's life. They may actually tell one of the parents after the session, and the parents will actually say, "How did you know that?" Yes, that's exactly what happened. And it can be something that has never been talked about before in the family. So this again validates the reality of this. And the strange thing is that ancestral trauma, to my understanding, is the only part of regression therapy which is scientifically provable, where they've done tests, I think, on mice and rats to traumatize a mouse or a rat, and then they found that further down the genetic line, ancestors of the initial rat are being traumatized by the same thing. So it does travel down the ancestral line. But often I think it can be a genetic thing in many cases, although we get the very unusual cases where it actually isn't in the genes and it's almost like an energy that is passed down to subsequent generations. So that's my sort of preamble. Anything you want to add on that at all, Monique? And because what I'd like to do, if you just share, have you got a client case you can share with us?
Yeah, I think what you had mentioned about it being this sort of energy sometimes too is interesting, because I had a client where it was, I think we were, 4 or 5 generations back, and it wasn't a direct relative. It was one of her great, great, great aunts. So genetically it wasn't going from mother and down like that. And she's like, no, it was something else. It was, my sister. So it's always interesting when that happens, when it's not directly gone, but it's this energy that comes through from different branches of the family.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it can be so strong and so potent. And of course, when we do the regression, it can be so powerful to clear this stuff because it means we're working again on the roots of an issue and the issue starts to get better.
No, I have a client. It was actually a really interesting bonding experience for her and her mother, because she ended up going into her mother's earlier life as a teenager. So I always find it interesting when we're not going too far back, and especially when these relatives are still alive. And like you said, you can talk to them about it after and get confirmation. On this particular client, we're working on her migraines, and she had gone back to a time in her mother's life as a teenager where she was at this party and she was feeling good and confident about herself. And then there was this group of girls, these, mean girls, as we would call them, that were not talking very nicely about the mom and kind of ruined this whole experience for her. And that was the energy we were bringing through. And as we know, sometimes it has nothing to do directly with what we're working on, that here's the migraines, here's this experience. It's not like her mother hit her head and it makes logical sense, but there's this connection somewhere. The subconscious has connected this for us, and maybe we don't need to always logic the reason why. There's, this kind of tangled wire between here, and we're trying to use our conscious brain. Well, how does that make sense? How does her being ridiculed at this party have anything to do with my client's migraines? But it did reduce the migraines at the end. So all we have to do is trust the subconscious knows more than we do about what needs to be worked on. And this was a story she was never told. And she had gone back to her mother and was telling her about this experience in our session. And her mother just looked at her like she was crazy. How did you know? And it's such a little event too, obviously a little event that made a big emotional impact in her mother's life, but wasn't something that was documented, right? Like a birth or a wedding or something like that. And her mother was just in awe that she knew all these details, and she could still, to this day, so showing what an impact it's had on her, to this day, as an adult, her mother remembered that exact party and those girls and how she felt in that scenario.
Gosh, yeah. Wonderful. So as you say, this A to B, B is the problem, A is the cause. Quite often it goes from A to B very easily, but sometimes, as you say, it's a tangled wire that comes to B, and we can't say why this is this. Doesn't matter. All we do is release A, and B gets better. So I'm just thinking around this as well. I'm just one of my clients. She went back into her mother's life. I'm going to check my notes actually because it was quite an in-depth session. As with when we do regression, we will regress back into any one or more of 5 areas of our lives. So if we're going back into an ancestor's life, it may be the trauma is in the ancestor's adult life. In your case there, your clients there, it was in her adolescence. Obviously, we do a lot of childhood work, clearing traumas in our ancestors' childhoods. In this case, my client went back into her mother's birth, so her mother's time at birth experience. And as we know, we do quite a lot of rebirthing for our clients in this life. But in this session, it was about reliving the birth in her mother's life. And she saw herself, she was in an old-fashioned sort of operating theatre. Nurses were around wearing old-fashioned clothes, and they were shouting at each other, shouting at the mum to push. And the mum was struggling very hard to push. And she said, I feel stuck. So my client is actually in the body of her mum as the baby. I feel stuck. I'm sort of halfway in, halfway out. My half of my body is free, half is stuck. I feel very trapped and very claustrophobic, and I've got a really bad headache. And then she said something, and she started to move her head around, and she said something is metal is on my head, and it's pulling, and it's pulling. And her head started to move around from side to side, and then she was out. She was born, and she was relaxed, and she said, I feel all very floppy. But my mother isn't there. Because what we usually want as soon as we're born is to get passed to our mother. But she said, my mother isn't there. There's an older gentleman, I think, and a woman, my grandmother. I'm being held by my grandmother. And she said, I'm realizing, she said, my grandmother there's no love from my grandmother. She's just doing this out of duty. I don't think my mother's coming back. And the man is a soldier and he's crying. And obviously what had happened is that her mum had actually died as a result of the birth. And the death of the mother was held against my client's mother by her grandmother all through her life. She blamed her all the time. And she didn't give her any love. She just brought her up without any affection. She kept, and in the life as the child, as my client became her mother as a child, she said, there's no joy. There's no joy in the life. I'm just existing. I have to be good because I'm being told I'm lucky that someone is going to look after me. So, that was a very powerful experience for her. And what happened then is she went into her mother's life as her mother gave birth to her. So my client is then her mother giving birth to her as the baby. And she said, it's forceps again. They're using forceps. And as her mother, she said, I'm feeling very drained. It's a very difficult birth. It's like my birth. And I'm losing blood. And they have to give her blood afterwards. And then the baby is born. Mother is okay. But she said, I don't know how to be a mom. I don't know how to be a mom. And my client then spontaneously went into her own birth just after the birth when her mother wasn't holding her. Her mom wasn't holding her. She said, I'm not wanted. I don't feel good enough. I'm not wanted. And she then realized, she said, I've closed myself down because I've never felt safe. I've never felt safe, and I've closed all of my feelings down. I do this all the time. I shut myself down. I don't cry. I just shut myself down. And so this energy that had come down from her mother and her mother's mother, you could say, all the way down through to her, had affected her throughout the whole of her life about shutting her emotions down, especially if she's in a difficult relationship. And she had so many learnings from that. So not only did we release the energy of her mother's traumas, but also we released the energy, and she got this understanding for her of one reason why she's been like she has been.
And so what about the other relatives in your experience? Do you find for any of those relatives that are involved, like her mother, do you find that they receive any benefit from this as well, or does it depend?
It's a good question. It's one I've never been able to truly answer. There are some therapists who would say, if we're working to release trauma that we've inherited from our mom or our grandmother, then when we release that, they will get the benefit. And there's a part of me that understands that and agrees with that, because obviously energetically we're very connected to our parents and grandparents. So if we're working on ourselves as we heal, there has to be some form of healing to them. However, my more psychotherapeutic take is that we all have our own original pain work to do. And therefore, really, her mum has to do her own pain work, her own therapy work in order to fully heal. But certainly, I think there is some healing will happen for that ancestor. And there is also this concept more esoterically. If we're working on an ancestor who died, who's already dead, so maybe 5 generations back or 3 generations back, and we're working for them, there is this concept that they are healing even though they're in spirit. And of course, shamanistically, they would say, Native American shamans would say that our ancestors are always with us. And therefore, if we're doing some work now to heal ourselves through them, then they will get some healing in spirit. Okay, that's more esoteric, of course, but it's a good question, Monique. It may be that these ancestors are getting healing as well.
And I mean, directly, if your client ever chooses to become a mother herself, then she's breaking this pattern that she's not going to pass on to any future generations because of the work that she's done.
Yes. And that's the other thing, where these patterns can sometimes come down through the generations. And we suddenly realize why I have done this at this time in my life, because my dad did the same at the same time in his life. And it was a trauma for him. And I'm now following that same pattern. And so again, that understanding can release the pattern. Good point. Yeah.
I think it's also interesting because it allows the client in the session to have this different perspective of people in their family that they haven't had the ability to. I remember hearing a story about, I think it was someone had gone to, one of their parents' funerals, and all these people were sitting there speaking, and he was sitting here thinking, oh, well, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that my dad had this side and this side and this side, because as the child, you only saw this one side. So my client, she had ended up going into her grandfather's life. And she's actually been really interested in kind of tracing things in her family tree. And so she has all these great memories of her grandfather, but from, again, of that perspective of a child and her grandfather, but never as kind of a man and a businessman before she was born. So she had ended up going back to kind of his earlier life when he was this high-powered businessman and traveled a lot, and very much the head of the household, right? This kind of the very stereotypical, have to be the man of the family, suppress the emotions down, everything like that. And she kind of got a bit of a peek behind the curtain of what was really going on that he wasn't able to show. So this client in particular, we're working on anxieties and fear around flying. And something that comes up when these anxieties and panic attacks surface is kind of a closure in the throat. So often just a very physical feeling of the throat being closed up and an inability to swallow. And before we went into her grandfather's life, we had gone through several past lives, one which involved flying, another one where she was actually executed by beheading in the past life. So again, having to do with the throat. And this grandfather, we had gone back to a time where his niece had died in a plane accident. And so not only were we talking about the flying, and that was a direct correlation, like we had talked about before. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. This was curiously a very direct correlation with the plane, but also him processing the grief and the trauma around this big tragedy in the family, and the inability for him to express those emotions as being this kind of head of the house and this man. And even in the beginning, she was talking about when it happened and he was going through shock, that he went out with only the men in the family, that the men of the family met up at this pub together to drink. And this was kind of the way. They didn't really talk about it. They just all sat together and drank. And then he had to go on. He had a wife and children, and he had to go back to work, and he flew all over the world for work. And then she had gone into a time where he was traveling for work after his niece had passed. And this experience of being in the plane, and all of a sudden this panic started to rise in him, and the throat had started to close up, and how he pushed that down with drink. And we're not talking about excessive drinking, but just pushing it down with having a drink. I'm on the plane. I have to do this. I have a high powered position. I have a family to take care of, that I don't have time to get emotional about these sort of things. So she relived a bit of that experience and what was really going on emotionally for him that none of the rest of the family ever saw. As well as some other things. But the big thing was just all the pressure he was under, that he was under so much pressure. And he was the eldest of 7. And he was talking about how he took care of his family, and, how he takes care of his mom still, and just this immense pressure and heaviness his whole life. So it wasn't only about the incident with the niece passing, but all these other pressures in his life that he was never able to fully open up about. And my client at the end, she was really, really touched and really emotional about it. And she said, I would have loved to know this side of him, that I would have loved to know this man, that I always kind of got this compassion from him. And she said, it makes sense now with everything that he had to deal with in his lifetime. So it's almost bringing you closer to that relative as well, even though he's not alive anymore. It brought more understanding, I think, to her, and why he was the way he was. And it cleared up things for her in the throat. So after she felt an immense release during session in the throat, she felt a physical pressure kind of coming up in the throat, almost like a pop. It was just very, very kinesthetic, very physical in her body, that something was coming out of the throat. And after just this lightness and post-session that week, she had done things that in the past would have made her feel anxious. She's kind of pushing herself to keep going with this, and to try things that would have made her nervous in the past, to see if where we're going. And so she's been doing these things that would have made her anxious before. And since these sessions, the throat issues haven't been coming up at all.
Really good. Yeah. So you had the double whammy there. One was the release of the trauma from his body, from his energy field, and also the understanding this is why he was, and this is where some of my fear of flying is coming from. And that also is another healing process, as well, as we know. So, well, that's really good. Excellent stuff. And I just want to share a quick story. A client who went even further back. So we're talking about, at the moment, we're talking about recent ancestors, but I said at the start, sometimes clients go way, way back, many generations back. And this client was, she went back 4 generations back into the life of a maternal great-great-grandmother. And she saw the grandmother as a child, and she went into the grandmother's life as the child. And they were very poor. It was just poor, living in a mining village in England. So they were proud people, but living a very frugal life. 7 children, to 6 siblings. A mother just giving birth regularly. The children just had to work. So from an early age, and she said, I'm about 7 years old and I'm having to bring the coal in, and I'm fed up of this. I'm fed up of working. And the mother just put them down all the time, just work, 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 get things done. And there was no joy, there was no love there. It was just very utilitarian existence. And in fact, as she came into her teenage years, she just got married just to get out of the home environment. And she'd always wanted, then she started to give birth, so she had children. And she wanted to bring her family up in a higher standard that she'd experienced. So she worked very hard as an adult in order to have money to send her children to school so that they could be raised to hopefully get better existences when they got older. Excuse me. And so we worked through that. We also went through the death as well. We went through that ancestor's death, the great-great-grandmother's death in an old age, and a relief, really. It'd been a hard life. And my client then realized at the end of the session, this is what I'm saying, with the understanding that comes through, that's where my poverty consciousness comes from, she said. My fear about money, it's been there for all my life. All my life, I'm anxious, I'm worried about money. That's where my poverty consciousness comes from. And so therefore, two things there. One was releasing the energies from that great-great-grandmother that were in my client, causing her blockages, and also having that understanding, okay, that's where this comes from. And that understanding very often just by itself clears the problem, helps the client to release the problem. So, these are just amazing stories. I mean, I had another client whose great-grandfather was in the Nazi party in the Second World War, and he was involved killing people, doing horrible things. So she actually went into his life, and we had to do a lot of work on his anger, because he was an angry person. He'd been forced to join up and forced to do these hideous things. So often what we do at the end of an ancestral session, we send love to that ancestor, wherever they are in the universe. We send them love. And that's also quite a healing for our clients as well. So, and it's just, as we know, Monique, it's just damned powerful therapy.
Yeah. Yeah.
If it didn't work, we wouldn't be doing it. So, yeah. And as I said at the start, I just think it's so fascinating.
Oh, it is. It really is. And being able to share these stories with your family afterwards, there's something really special about it as well. But the past life stories, of course, are always really intriguing, but some of the bonding that happens afterwards is really special as well.
Very much so, yeah. Okay, thanks so much, Monique. That's fascinating. Thanks for sharing your stories. And I hope you good people have enjoyed listening to us, and keep tuned in. We'll keep sharing our thoughts on regression as we keep going. Thanks very much for watching, and lots of love to everybody.
Thanks for listening to Adventures in Regression Therapy. For more information about Steve Burgess and his team, check out steveburgesshypnosis.com or connect on Facebook or Instagram. Steve's books, The Power of Past Life Regression and Famous Past Lives, are available through his website and Amazon, and are available as audiobooks through Audible. Free hypnotherapy recordings are available on YouTube on Hypno for All. That's Hypno, the number 4, all.